Well, hello everyone. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Paul. How are you, mate? Long
I'm
time no
pretty good,
see.
mate. Yeah, pretty good. So I thought we'd start off this by talking about where we are, because some people might sort of come into this video and not have watched the previous ones. And I think it's kind of important to watch the previous ones simply because there are specific aspects that we're ignoring now because we're going to make the assumption that they're already in place. I think the first one, so our first video was 50 to 70 feet, right? Learning to cast, going from 50 to 70, which was mostly about how we use the body, right? And the double haul. So quite simple. And then and that's 70 feet is actually, I think 75 feet is often the casting instructor's distance. So it is actually quite a reasonably long cast. And then we jumped last week to 100 feet plus. So, and there is a jump. I mean, it doesn't go from 70 to 100, but the things that take you from 70 to 100 is pretty much doing the same stuff better, right? So we went to 100. This time we're going up to 110 to 115. Now that's suddenly a very serious cast. To have got to this point, it doesn't just happen. This is training. One thing I should mention here is we are really talking about these distances to a 5-weight line, aren't we? It's going to be slightly further if it's a 6-weight. It's going to be further again if it's a 7. 8's probably about the same as 7, and then you go up to, I don't know 9 so well, but if you go up to a 10, you start to lose distance. So there's another one we're going to do afterwards, which is 120 feet. And 120 feet with a 5-weight is the equivalent, I think, as 130 feet with a 6-weight. And with a 7-weight, that can even be 140 something, 140 to 145. That's the equivalent. But for 10-weight, I'm back down to about 115, I think. So it's like this bell curve, and that's going to change depending on how strong you are. I think somebody built like Arnold Schwarzenegger would probably find the 10-weight goes further, right? So, but so there is a kind of, it's like throwing a shot put when you get heavier and heavier. Imagine if you've got a 15-weight, for example. So yeah, anything you want to sort of add to that, Nick?
It's about getting it straight and being efficient, I think, Paul, which is what we're going to talk about in this 110-foot cast. And 110 foot away from 100, it sounds like nothing, but there's a point of diminishing returns after 100 feet. So it's going to be, you're going to have to be really critical about your technique and really focusing on things that are going to make you cast a little bit further. So it's being more efficient. So efficiency for me is not about what more you can add to your stroke. It's what you can't take away. So it's almost the bare minimum of what you need. So everything's going to be really efficient.
That brings us in, I think, very nicely to having a discussion about overhang and what we're trying to achieve here, and heads. And because there was a lot of comments on the last video, because you asked me something about, do you shoot on the last backcast? And I sort of said, so sometimes when I'm fishing, not when I'm doing competition, apart from maybe some other things. And then there was a lot of comments about that. So I think we probably need to get into that, because in this one, it actually matters. Okay, so
definitely.
So let's discuss this a little bit. Overhang is the amount of running line between the rod tip and the end of the head when you're casting, when you're false casting, or before you launch. Okay, so to give you an example, let's have an extreme example here to get the numbers right. Let's take an outbound short, which has a 30-foot head. Okay, now it would be possible to cast that. And let's just say you made a back cast and you are holding the backing knot in your hand, and all of that line is straight out behind you. So you've got the 30-foot head. Now my rod's 9 feet and my haul is 6. Let's just say there's about 15 feet between the backing knot, which is being held, and the rod tip. Okay, it's probably a little bit less, but we'll just call it 15. Okay, so we've got 15 feet taken up there. They got 30 feet of the head back there. That means it's a 100-foot line, right? So that means there is 55 feet of overhang between the rod tip and this head that's out there. Okay, those are the numbers. That is not how to cast an outbound short. That is just not going to work, because now you've got 55 feet of very thin running line trying to form a loop, probably does form a loop, and then you've got this head back there. And I think this is an important to realize, because when we are casting, okay, when we cast, we're bending the rod, we then stopping or initiating the stop, and the rod goes into, here's another term, maximum counterflex. It dips right down. So to give you a bit of what's really going on here, as it passes, it's bent, it comes and passes rod straight position. That's when it's traveling the quickest. And then it comes down and it goes into maximum counterflex. Now, this is all forming the loop. Okay. So this, now what we try to do, one thing we can do to start with is, I want to try at this point of maximum counterflex, I want running line in this loop, and I want to position the head at the very top of the loop. Okay, so that's the other point. As soon as we get that head into the loop, the dynamics of the loop changes. It doesn't morph very quickly. The loop wants to turn over quickly. There's a lot of mass in there. So we want to place, at the very minimum, we want to place that head at the very top of the loop at maximum counterflex. Okay, that's our minimum position. Now let's take the Mastery Expert distance. Okay, it's a 68-foot head. Let's see how much line we've got to cast. So we've got 68-foot head. I reckon we've probably got in this initial loop shape, maybe 5 feet. Okay, so we're up to 73. We've got a 9-foot rod. So we're up to 82, and let's say a 6-foot haul approximately. So now what are we up to now? We're up to 88 feet, okay, which is actually about the starting point on my 170 cast where I measure it. Okay, so I have to start about 88-foot carry to keep the head out of the initial forming of the loop. Okay, that is probably the most stable way to cast any weight forward line. Okay, to have that head initiated at the very top of the loop. But there are advantages to extending that length of running line and putting the head further back from the front of the loop. So if you were to let's take our outbound short again. At one time, we have this very unstable loop with this huge amount of carry, and the head is 55 foot back from the tip. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we can have the head at the very top of the loop. Okay. Ideally, we need to put it somewhere between the two. And the further back we go, we're putting the head, the less stable the loop is. But if it unrolls, it goes further because there's more line up in that fly leg of the loop. Now, there are times when we can do that. If we've got a tailwind, if we can shoot a little bit more line back there, that wind can just help sort everything out and it goes. Okay, so if I were to put, now we're jumping up to probably the next one here and not dealing with this one, but if I was to cast that med, I start at 88, it's actually 88.5 feet, and I gradually extend it to about 92.5 feet, depending on the conditions. There is one exception to that, and that is if you've got a very strong wind, sometimes you can just shoot more line back there and it's going to hook up and it's going to fly. Okay, but it is a gamble. I would get the long cast in first and then maybe throw a wild one to try and hook one up, but you're going to be very inconsistent. And I often see people carrying too much line. Now, we had somebody asking about how to cast one of these very short-headed lines that we generally call bricks on a string, right? And so I would start by positioning the head at the top of the loop. So working out how much overhang that's going to be. Maybe it depends on the loop shape, right? Depends how much the tip though it goes down. But it's probably somewhere between 2 and 4 feet of overhang. And then you can gradually experiment. when you've got a line that you're using all the time, you can work that out very clearly. Okay, and it becomes fixed. You can even mark it if you want to, so that you know how much line you've got. So anyway, that's how I see it. I think we have this very important thing called this pencil the head. We want to point that head at the very top of the loop, and we can gradually extend it and see what happens. What we don't want is a huge amount of running line with this head back here.
So I really liked about what you said about that, about the overhang, Paul. That's a really fantastic explanation. But just to show people, I've got a Rio, what's it called? Single-handed spay line here. So it's got a bit of wool on the end of my leader. So I'm just going to take it out. So this is the head. This is a peach coloured head. So I'm going to take it out, take it out, take it out, and it will go into this green running line. Now, what I see on forums, etc., is get colour change to the tip and it'll fly. Well, the colour change usually signifies the end of the head, which is the back taper, and the start of the running line. And as Paul says, if you keep the head at the top of the loop, what happens is the loops won't be very tight because the head's been pulled around the loop during rod counterflex, which is not what you want. So to add to that, you need to add what we call overhang. And what I do is I find the end of the head. So if it's got a colour change, you can do it like this, or if it hasn't got a colour change like my other line, you can use some calipers to find the end of the back taper and the start of the running line. So once you've found that, if you have a compact stroke, so we're going to be talking about open stance distance. So we're going to be talking about the open stance technique for this cast. And that's quite compact. So my hand doesn't go any further back than my shoulder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mimic a cast, and I'm going to keep this here. And what you can do is you can hold a tape measure. You can hold a tape measure, the end of the tape measure with this hand, and you can let it slide through your fingers with this hand. And what you can do is you can get a very precise measurement of your haul. So for me, for a compact stroke, that's 3 feet. That is exactly 3 feet. And that's significant because when we're hauling, we're pulling the line back through the rod. So when you've finished your haul, the head's going to be closer to the rod tip, if that makes sense. So we need to take that into account to make sure that the head's out the top of the loop. So just to throw out some numbers, if I have the head at the top of the loop, I'll add about 3 feet for rod counterflex to make the loop with the running line, the initial loop with the running line. And then I'll have 3 feet on top of that, and that's a nice starting point. And if it's a long head like this, that will go a very long way. You can adjust it, so you can add a little bit more to dial in release timing. So if you release a little bit later than rod straight position, you're going to have to add more line because the line has to shoot round a curve, which is the rod counterflex. So as Paul says, just play with it. But what I do is I add about 6 feet on top of the head, which gives me a nice starting point, and then I can just play around with positions. So
it's very specific, isn't it? And it's not, and the reason is, if we talk a little bit about if that head goes into the loop at loop formation, what actually happens is the loop's still the same. Actually, it just doesn't tighten through as it travels through the air in the same way. You've got line in there, and it just keeps it wider. But if that counterflex is all running line, bang, and you've got the head here, as this, the rod will kick back up, and the dynamics change, and it becomes a very different look. And you can play with that. You can actually cast with. You can try that and see when that moment happens, and then I would play with adding 1 foot at a time to see what it is. Okay. we actually run into a big problem. If we are distance casting all out for 30-foot head, it's actually quite a lot of overhang that we need. So in a competition, I will start quite short, but I will sometimes we have these competitions where you've got 2 minutes, you're going to try and work it out and get your longest cast, and it's one of these 30-foot heads. So I start, with it close to the rod tip, and then I add 3 feet, then I add 3 feet, then I add 3 feet, and hopefully at one of these points I find the sweet spot. But it might be with a 30 feet of overhang to make it go. It's definitely not with 60 feet of overhang. I know that, right? So it's somewhere between those 2 points. Better off. I really don't like these short heads. I would like a head that at my maximum carry is just at the very top of the loop, or just behind, not with a huge amount of overhang where it becomes unstable. I think we've covered that pretty much in depth.
Yeah, I hope that answers the chap's question. That was
It really is about what do you want to achieve, what do you want to achieve in the back cast, so that when you launch the forward cast, what is the line configuration in the fly leg? That is what we're looking at here. And it gets very specific. Now, for this particular cast, right, we're talking 110, 115. We've got to try and get that head out. We really want to have that head out. I mean, it's a compact stroke, so so you're right, it's a little bit less line. It's not a 6-foot haul. It's a 3-foot haul. So the line is a little bit less compared to something like, the 170 that we're going to carry on later. And I'm just watching a little Gourami down here. So kind of threw me. It's only about this big though. So we are trying to get we're trying to get a carry up there about 86 feet, aren't we? For this cast. We have definitely moved up a gear here in technique.
Oh, definitely for the MED. Yeah, it's right up there.
This is getting pretty serious. So let's get into this then. Let's talk. Firstly, we haven't really talked much about tracking yet. We've kind of skipped through it. Now it's really important.
Absolutely.
Now it matters. Key number one now is, how do we develop straight tracking? Tracking is like the bird's eye view of what the rod tip is doing, and it's the positions of our targets. And we haven't talked about this yet. I think for this, to learn this specifically, we need to be sighting our targets before we make a cast. That means we have to look at our back target, cast to it, and while the loop is unrolling, we have to look at our front target and we cast to it. So you can always see if somebody knows what they're doing here, because they turn their head first. They look, cast, turn the head, look, cast. So let's teach that. How does somebody learn to do that?
I'll just put this down here. I take the rod butt in the mirror. I stand like I'm going to cast. And what I'm looking for is the tip of this rod butt to go perfectly straight back and forward. If it goes off to the side, or if it goes out to the side, then there's a problem. So I think that's important for fishing, because you can improve your tracking without having to look. But then when we get into the high level casting, so the competition like what we're doing now, we need to get it going straight, but we also need to look at targets as well to ensure that we are moving this rod tip as straight as possible and our hands as straight as possible. So what I like to do, I've got a tape measure set up, as I always do for these videos. And what I'll do is, before I train, I'll stand about halfway down the tape measure and I will look down the tape measure and see what's behind me. Now, I have a small silver birch tree, which I know because I've already looked down it. But if I look down this tape measure, there's a silver birch that is perfectly down this tape measure. And if I look down this side, there's a hawthorn bush perfectly down this tape measure. So those are my two targets, and they're quite a long way away. I mean, what would that be? About 400 feet away. So they're quite a long way. If your targets are really far apart, you can you can usually throw straight.
Yeah.
Just going back.
Sorry, another way of doing that, if you haven't, I mean, if you've got a tape measure, which you should have, that's great. But sometimes you might be in a situation where you haven't. What I would do this as an experiment is first sort of look at your front target, and then just for yourself, then look at your back target and mark it. Okay, what you think it is. Then take your rod, put it on the ground, pointing at the front target. Walk around the rod and look down the rod and see how much you are off. Because generally everybody looks there and they're about 20, 30 degrees off. It's back here. So pick that. So you've got to put the rod down, walk around, pick that target and see where it is.
I like that,
You'll be amazed how everybody's off. Everybody's off by usually 20, 30 degrees, sometimes more. And of course, that's a big problem because the loop comes over, as we talked about last week. Okay.
If you stand perfectly down the tape measure and you're off axis with the rod, the line's going to go over to my right and it's going to come forward and create a tracking fault. So if you're practicing down the tape measure, just find out in the mirror how far you are off vertical, and then just stand a little bit away from the tape measure to make sure that this tip tracks along the tape measure, and still look at your targets as well. I think that's quite an important thing.
I think
catches some people out.
It's better. I think it's certainly better to be more vertical. I think that's very important because we want as vertical a loop as possible coming straight over a rod. It seems to be the most efficient way, and we want our counterflex preferably to kick a line to the loop. And you stand down and tape and you watch people casting. It's often, even really good casters, it's a little bit into the side. I mean, it can, and it's one of the hardest things to do. And I think one of the problems is, while it would be ideal to be straight and have the line coming straight over the rod tip, as our bodies are more powerful coming off to the side, so we kind of sacrifice. There's a balance, sacrificing the amount of power that we can put in with how straight we can be. I would definitely go on towards straighter more than power, as far as I'm concerned. I think if we can, the straighter we can be, the better it is. But the truth is, we're a little bit off to the side. So let's have that drill. So there's a really good drill here, which is to pick the target, back cast, let it go on the ground, pick the front target, forward cast, let it go on the ground, because that's the best way to learn it.
I'm going to get some line out. So we're talking, what, about 60 feet of line? Maybe?
They're a high level caster now.
So when open stance distance, just like the other video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the line nice and straight in front of me. I'm going to look at my back target. I'm going to cast and see where it lands. So I'm going to just drop the rod. Might go off frame a little bit. Okay. So I'm looking at this tree, and it is along this line, and it is pointing at the tree. So that's good. It's a good start. So now what we can do is go the other way. So raise the rod to an angle, just like you finished your back cast, and I'm gonna look at my target in front, and I'm gonna look at it, target, and then cast. And it should go perfectly to the target. Look behind. You do this a few times, let it land on the floor. Sorry, got wrapped around the microphone a bit there. Look at the front target, cast. Back target, cast. Forward target, cast.
So I look at my back target here, which I've picked out, which is a stump. I look to the target, make the cast, bang. I then look to the front target, make that cast. So that now I know I've got these two targets and my shoulders in the middle of this. I need to do it with a bit of rotation. So I must look first, and that's why we're putting it on the ground, is to train ourselves to look first. Look, cast. Look, cast. And then we're going to pick it up. All right. It's going to take a while to learn this. Took me a while to figure it out in the first place, but just dialing it in is going to take practice. And that's why it gives ourselves time here. Back target, cast. Front target, cast. Now I actually go, when I pick it up, I go back target, and what I do is I go back target, I check the loop form. I don't watch it fully unroll, because if I watch it fully unroll, I've got no front target. So while it's unrolling, I look at my front target. So back target, check the loop, front target, and then my next thing I do, my last thing I look for, I talked about this last week, is this rod, is the upper part of this rod coming through. So those are my 4. I do that every time I'm distance casting. I look target, cast, check the loop, look target, look for the rod coming through. Okay.
So I think this is a good place to recommend some lines. So I know you like using the MED, and I do as well, but there are quite a few different lines that we can use just to make this a little bit easier, because the short heads are pretty difficult to cast further than 100 feet. So as I mentioned before, so this is the Ballistic Pro Performance 5-weight line. I know Paul likes to use the MED. I do as well. There's some others. You can have the Scientific Anglers Mastery Trout or the Mastery Standard. They've both got decent length heads. So those were the ones that I'd recommend. And maybe even the Rio Technical Trout. That's a nice line as well.
Or a double taper. I learned with a double taper.
Or a double taper.
Maybe one of the best. Because with a double taper, if there's 100 feet, you can carry. It's a great one to work with.
That probably leads me nicely on to an exercise that James came up with, which is using old double tapers or old lines that you've used on grass. They're all cracked, where you can cut them into shooting heads. So his beginning shooting head is 60 feet. So the head itself is 60 feet long. And what he does is he puts some thin mono at the back, and he places a flag on 75 feet. And by a flag, what I mean is it's just a bit of electrical tape. So you know exactly how much you're carrying. And with that head, you can carry that single-handed, or you can haul it, which is a really interesting exercise. And we've spoken about carry in our previous videos, but what does carry actually mean? So carry is how much line you're holding in the air from your hauling hand to the end of the fly line, but it's a controlled carry. So if you feel like if you cast it a little bit more and it's going to drop to the floor, that's not your maximum carry. So maximum carry is when you can make adjustments, so you can do trajectory adjustments, you can play with the force that you apply and things like that. So a good training drill for that would be about 10 cycles. So you should be able to hold these shooting heads with 10 casting cycles, or just any carry in particular. He also has what's called a mega head of doom, which is it's a 75-foot head, and it gives you a, let me get this right, is it 90 or 95-foot carry when he puts the flag on? So 75, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8, a 90-foot carry. So that's not going to be single-handed, that's going to be double-hauled. But those are just nice if you're just learning this, because it doesn't let you shoot the line. So you don't get distracted by trying to shoot as far as you can. You're just working on one specific thing, which is carry, and that's a big thing, and that's really important for learning to cast long. So don't know what you think about that, Paul, but that's what helped improve my competition distance, was just making some shooting heads and then just going out and practicing with that rather than a full line and chewing your nice lean line up on grass when you can practice with these shooting heads for training.
Well, the way I really sort of work, and I still work on my carry, is to elevate myself. So I used to park, when I was in New Zealand, I used to park my truck on the side of a cliff overlooking the Waiau, and just have it, in the evening, have a few glasses of wine or a beer, and put some music on and just cast over the cliff and at my maximum carry point. And it was great because there was, on one side I was probably 20 feet above the ground, and on the other side I was probably about 200 feet above the ground. I had all the time in the world. The loop could go back. I could let that loop go down, and then and straighten up, and I could pick it out. And it allowed me to work on all sorts of things, all sorts of different power applications. And there was no problem with the line snagging the grass, because it wasn't really, it'd have to be a pretty wild cast for that to happen. So that was probably one of the highlights. And I still do that. I've got the roof of the boat here, which is about, 10 feet above the water, and that's one of the places I practice. So that's definitely one of the keys for me. And I think you have to work back from the forward cast. So our forward cast is 15 degrees up. We've got some target up there that we're trying to throw the loop over. In my mind, I'm trying to throw the rod tip or the loop over the top of this tree in the distance. So for that to happen, because it's elevated, our back cast has to be angled down a little bit. Okay. Now, of course, it's gravity that's going to set it down there too, but I'm very aware of exactly where I'm sighting. And it's usually around the horizon, which means for the rod tip, it's come down. Might be the horizon, might be a little bit above, but where that rod tip, it's actually got an angle down. I don't know what you do there.
Yeah, I do exactly the same, Paul. And I know, because I've seen it, other videos on YouTube, they recommend a high back cast and letting it drop and then come forward. Now, there's a problem there, because once the loop has straightened, then sag's going to start to set in.
It's a terrible piece of advice. If you want a low back cast, send it low, and then then it straightens and you can come forwards. Don't cast it high and then let it flutter down. That's not good. That's not good advice either. So you really want to aim towards your target, and then you're picking it out the air when it's straight. No, that's just,
it'll contribute to the dangling end, and then it will catch the grass coming forward. So you don't want to do that. You just want to put it there.
Absolutely.
And then it'll be nice and straight, and you can launch it, and then you can launch it forwards. Yeah,
there is a lot of bad information out there. I guess they probably haven't been in the competition world, I guess. I don't know. All right. Now the bit that really mattered. Okay, so we've got that back cast. We've got our line carry. We're straight. We know what we've got, the right amount of line just behind the rod tip. We've got the right configuration there. Now we're going to deal with the bit that puts it all out there, is the launch. So let me show you how to teach this launch. So we have come on our back cast, we've come on to a bent back leg, which I'll show you on the roof of the boat later. But I come onto a bent back leg, bang, and I come forward now onto a bent front leg. Now we've come onto the weight's coming to the front foot. I'm turning the body, which gets this rod hand in front of the line hand. And now look at my position. It's like I feel like I'm underneath the rod, which I am. I'm underneath it. And I'm going to initiate the cast by pushing up from this front knee. And as I push up from the front knee, I'm going to try to take that part of the rod, and I'm going to sling the loop over the top of my target in the distance. So it gets into that position before we launch. And I think this is really important, because we are not launching from here. We're coming through into this position, and this is where we're going to try the hit. Okay, so it's here, whack. So it's late, and we've got lots of cues, and we've talked about lots of those, looking for the rod tip. But the most important is to get underneath this, get the rod in front, and then get your target, and you're going to put the whole body into this cast by straightening up this front leg. You can learn this. So I teach this by getting somebody to pause. So we make our back cast, right? We make our forward cast. We're going to get into position. I say, now we're about to launch. Look where you are. You've come forward, and instead of launching, you stop. And the position you want to be in is you want your right shoulder to be in front, slightly level or slightly in front of your left shoulder. You want your hand to be in front of the shoulder here, so that when you push, and you want your rod in front of the line hand, good bend in the elbow, so that when you push up from the left leg, you are driving the rod tip over, driving the rod butt over. Okay? David, I think it was, on YouTube, asked about the squeeze stop, because you hear a lot about the squeeze stop. And it's a very complicated, it's actually quite a very interesting question, because on the launch, I don't know about you, Nick, but I'm not, at this point, now we're talking like a 110, 115 distance cast, I am not making a squeeze stop. Instead of a squeeze stop, what I'm actually doing is I'm getting to that position where you kind of think about making the squeeze stop, but instead I'm accelerating all the way through, turning the rod over, just like I had a ball. Instead of making a squeeze, I'm going to just relax, turn it, throw it all the way over. So in here, and then it feels to me like a release. So I'm, instead of applying, the squeeze stop applies a power through. This is an acceleration before the stop, because it's a squeeze. The squeeze is a rapid rotation of the rod, but it's a very abrupt rotation of the rod. Instead, what we're trying to accomplish is, instead of an abrupt rotation of the rod, we are going to rotate that rod all the way forward so that the rod tip is pointing at the target. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. So yeah, I completely agree, Paul. And I think it's a little bit like what we discussed in a previous video about the finishing line and a sprinter. So if you imagine that this is the finishing line and there's a brick wall an inch after that finishing line, you're worried about slamming into the brick wall. So you're not going to get a lot of speed. But if you imagine, which is what sprinters do, they just blast straight through the finishing line. That is exactly as Paul said about finishing with the rod tip pointing at the target. So you're not trying to squeeze, which is a rapid rotation of the rod butt. It's a very relaxed throw, which is so this is a little bit different, especially when we get into the higher distances, I think, Paul.
Yeah, and I think the thing about it is, what you can do here, if you are thinking about the squeeze stop, that timing is actually when you apply the bulk of the acceleration into the stroke. So instead of making a very short, sharp arc, we're going to take that point and we're going to try and turn that rod over. And that squeeze stop is actually the point of our hit. But instead of making it abrupt, we are accelerating that rod all the way over. I think that, somebody said to me here, actually in Malaysia, they said, something you didn't tell us, because they really got into distance casting before I many years ago, 20 years ago. And one of the things they didn't realize was they had to unlearn the stop. And when they unlearned the stop, that is suddenly when they got the next 10 feet. So trying to make this abrupt stop, which may create can certainly create a tighter loop. We're not trying to do that. We are trying to throw it just like we were throwing a ball. So there is no tension. I don't know about you, but there's no real tension in the forearm. It's a release. It's just we get to that point, instead of squeezing, we rotate it. So it's no squeeze, but a rotate. And that's when we apply, That's when we apply the bulk of this force. It's when we get there and we get there. Whack. I nearly went over the side there. Hang on. This would be amazing.
Very enthusiastic casting, Paul.
Now, the interesting thing about that, okay, is when you get to that point, we are rotating the rod butt, right? We're applying the power. Instead of a squeeze stop, we're applying it as a rotation. And this is the bit that's going to make you to 110, 115, is you need to apply great force at this point. Now we're hitting it, right? For 100, we just had to let it go. At this point now, for this longer distance cast, this is when we're applying the force. And we're applying it through a rotation. I imagine there is a line that I draw down from about 60 degrees up where the clouds are, and I'm going to turn that rod tip down from that all the way down to my target. Let's talk about the hit, because so you know this is pretty straightforward now. I mean, I know we've got around a few things here, but actually what we're trying to accomplish here is quite straightforward. We're trying to have a couple of feet of running line at the top of the loop, trying to have the head behind that. On our back cast, we want that thing to really be as straight as possible, angled a little bit downwards, and then we come through, we get our whole body underneath it, and then we launch it as explosively as we can, aiming 50 degrees up. That's basically how I do it. And so long as we make the hit with a rotation, it's never going to tail, or it shouldn't tail. Where it can be wrong is when people try to push it forward without a rotation. It's the rotation that's applying torque to the rod, which is what makes it work. And late, biggest one of the big problems I see, and it's at all levels, is hitting it too soon, hitting it too early. So I mentioned this in a previous video. I look to see that rod coming through, and that's when I strike the power. And I strike the power around. I draw that rod tip from the clouds down to the target.
A little bit about body movement now, because we're really getting into competition distance. And as I said previously, a point of diminishing returns happens above 100 feet. So we've got to be really critical of our technique, make sure everything's nice and straight. We're putting the force in at the right time. But going back to what Paul said about the launch, and just get some line out here. So with the open stance, on the end of my back cast, my weight is on my back foot. So when I make the cast, I use body weight transfer. So now my arm is going along with my body weight. My arm then moves. So now my weight is on my front foot. And then when I get ready for the launch, all I'm going to do is rotate the rod, and then I'm going to push up with my, so this push up is helping me turn the rod over and making the cast. And it is really a push up. And you can see if you've transferred your weight properly, and you'll see a lot of distance casters, they'll able to wiggle their other foot in the air.
But how about we talk about cues? What goes through our mind? Because, you know, when we're doing this, we can only think of one thing at a time. And so I don't know about you. I make a cast and then I think, what could I do different? And then the next cast, I try to incorporate that. So I might go, well, maybe, that's just an example, right? I could go, well, maybe I could wait a little bit longer before making the power. So I look for that rod delaying a little bit more. Or I might go, oh, maybe I could make more weight shift, and I reposition my feet, or I aim a bit higher. So every cast, we're constantly giving ourselves a new cue to change what we do. So I start, and I get all of my students to start from the ground up. So there is a sequence, and I think obviously we've got foot position, we've got weight shift, then we've got torso, then we've got the shoulder, then we've got the elbow, and then what the wrist does, and when we're sighting, and then also the haul. So I work on that sequence, and I keep repeating it. I keep going around in circles. So if we cast for half an hour, we're not just trying to do the same thing all the time. We're always trying to develop it. We're trying to make every cast better than the last one. And I think that's why it's so bloody fascinating, and it can keep us busy at it for hours, because, you know, we're learning, we're educating ourselves, we're seeing what works. You know, I make a cast, and then I think, well, as I'm bringing in, I'm thinking, what do I want to focus on this cast? Okay, so that might be weight transfer. So in this cast, I'm just thinking about transfer from the foot coming up to the body. All right. Now, I wasn't quite happy with that. I would like it to be a bit straighter. So this particular cast, I'm thinking about taking that rod tip over that target in front, coming straight over the top to it. Now, that was a better cast. So more power now, more power at the end of the stroke. One of the other things I think is very important is to be smooth. Smoothness is the real key here. Although we're applying force, we've got to apply that gradually. You know, there's a hit at the end. Everything's got to be silky smooth. I also think about is something one of my friends always called fade, which is where at the end of the back cast, instead of thinking about going forward, we just sort of relax and go back a little bit as well. So I'll make that back cast just prior to the shots. Nice here. Bang. So my fade is there, which gets me into that position to really come through and drive it over.
Right, so my weight is on my left foot. I'm going to use body weight transfer to help me make the cast. I'm going to strip out all the slack, look at the back target, nice and compact, get a nice back cast, nice and compact. Lovely forward cast, fast haul, and that has gone just past the, just past the 110-foot cone pull. That has.
Well, that was certainly a bit more technical, as you'd probably expect. I hope that answered some of the questions that you were asking on the last video. I may create a few more. If you've got any questions on this, you can just stick them in below and we'll try our best to answer. Cheers.